In a world shaped by fear and divided by power, one quiet detective followed the truth hidden between nations. Join Miss Marple as she unravels the shadows of the Cold War from its first whisper to its final collapse. Chapter 1: The Beginning of Fear. It began, as many of Miss Marple's most curious investigations did, with a whisper soft enough to be overlooked, yet sharp enough to unsettle even the calmest of minds. It was the winter of 1945, London still trembling from the long ache of the Second World War. Streets were clearing rubble. Survivors were rebuilding lives. And everyone desperately wanted to believe that peace had finally arrived. Yet, as Miss Marple would later say with quiet seriousness, peace is rather like a house that looks tidy until you open a drawer. On that cold evening, wrapped in her warm grey coat, she entered King's College Hall, where a lecture was about to begin. The topic was simple enough: the world after the war, but the audience buzzed with an uneasy anticipation. Two scholars were invited: Professor Harold Elmswood, known for hopeful predictions, and Professor Victor Renck, whose pessimism was legendary. As Miss Marple settled into her seat, she noticed a peculiar tension between the two men. Renck's eyes moved sharply across the hall, as if he feared someone was watching him. Elmswood, in contrast, appeared strangely troubled, not intellectually, but emotionally. Miss Marple sensed it instantly. Something was about to shift, and she knew the signs well. Professor Renck spoke first. His voice cut through the cold hall like the edge of a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "the war is over, yes, but only the visible one. A new struggle has already begun, silent and dangerous. Not a war of armies, but of ideologies." A murmur spread through the audience. Renck lifted a paper. Winston Churchill speaks of an iron curtain descending across Europe. Two sides are forming, one claiming freedom, another claiming order, both claiming righteousness, and righteousness, when unbalanced, becomes perilous. Professor Elmswood shifted uncomfortably. His hands trembled slightly. Renck continued, leaning forward, lowering his voice. "You will hear terms like zones of influence, power blocks, ideological expansion. But let me phrase it plainly. Nations do not rest after victory. They prepare for the next fear." Miss Marple observed the audience carefully, widening eyes, tightened breaths. Fear was a curious creature. It could spread faster than flame. Then Elmswood rose. "Preposterous," he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "No nation wants another war. You are imagining ghosts." Renck gave a thin smile. "Ghosts have a habit of becoming real when ignored." The hall fell silent. Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease. She had lived long enough to know when a truth was being spoken, and Renck's truth felt heavy, too heavy to be dismissed. After the lecture, Miss Marple lingered near the exit, watching people disperse in heated conversations. Some laughed nervously, others whispered anxiously, but she had her eye on one man only, Professor Elmswood. He walked quickly, almost stumbling, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Miss Marple saw fear in his posture, the quiet kind that settles behind the ribs. She followed discreetly until he stepped outside into the fog. Before she could approach him, a figure in a dark coat stopped beside him. They exchanged hurried words. Elmswood nodded shakily, passed the man a small folded document, and disappeared into the mist. Miss Marple frowned. The next morning, the newspapers carried a chilling headline: "Professor Harold Elmswood, missing, last seen after university lecture." Authorities believed he had simply left London for a few days to rest. But Miss Marple felt otherwise. People who left for rest did not pass secret papers to strangers in the fog. Her suspicions sharpened when she received an unexpected envelope at her boarding house. Inside was a single line, written in hurried strokes. "The Iron Curtain falls sooner than they think." No signature, only a small chalk mark in the corner, the same mark she had seen earlier on the notes Elmswood carried during the lecture. Miss Marple knew then this was no ordinary disappearance. Miss Marple wasted no time. She retraced her steps to the lecture hall, searching for anything the authorities might have overlooked. Her years of solving quiet village mysteries had trained her well. People often forget that larger events also hide small human trails. Behind the hall, she found footprints leading toward the river, 2 sets, one hurried, one steady. She crouched, touching the frost on the prints. The hurried ones belonged to Elmswood. The steady ones matched the stride of the man in the dark coat. Nearby, she discovered a torn scrap of paper pressed into the mud. Carefully lifting it, she recognized part of Elmswood's handwriting. "They want the research. They think it will determine the future of Europe." But the rest was smeared beyond recognition. She slipped the fragment into her coat, heart tightening. Research? What research? And who were they? As she walked back toward the London streets, she heard voices across the river, men arguing in hushed tones. One voice she recognized, the same man from last night. "She tells someone if we don't stop him. Too late. He's already passed the message. Then we must retrieve the documents, all of them." Miss Marple stepped silently behind a lamppost, piecing the puzzle together. Someone feared Elmswood's information becoming public. Someone believed it might reveal the beginnings of a new global conflict. And now Elmswood had vanished. That night, Miss Marple sat by her small fireplace, reviewing the clues with the calm precision she used for even the most domestic of mysteries. A missing professor, a secret document, unknown men speaking of research and future of Europe, a cryptic message mentioning the Iron Curtain. She tapped her fingers gently on her notebook. "It is dreadfully clear," she whispered to herself. "The war has ended, yet the seeds of the next have already been planted." But she also sensed something else, something more human beneath the politics. Someone was afraid of knowledge escaping. Someone was willing to silence a scholar to stop it. And wherever fear pushed people into shadows, Miss Marple knew danger followed. She stood, fastened her coat, and prepared for the journey ahead. "Very well," she murmured. "If the world is marching into a new kind of conflict, then I must follow the trail before innocent people vanish into its fog." Outside, London lay wrapped in quiet darkness. But Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and unwavering intuition, had already taken her first step into the Cold War, and the mystery was only just beginning. Chapter 2: The Iron Curtain Mystery. Miss Marple had always believed that truth revealed itself to those who followed the smallest details, and the details of Professor Elmswood's disappearance had led her to a single conclusion. The answer lay somewhere in the heart of Europe, where nations were being broken apart and stitched back, together under invisible political hands. So, in early 1946, wrapped in her traveling coat and carrying her neatly labeled notebook, she boarded a train from London to Brussels. Europe was still wounded. Stations smelled of coal and dust, buildings leaned like tired soldiers, and people moved with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple sensed something else, a quiet tension, a watchfulness. On the train, she overheard 2 diplomats speaking lowly. "The Soviets are closing their borders," one whispered. "Stalin means to shape Eastern Europe as he likes. And the West, will they let him? They cannot afford another war." Their words echoed the warning sent anonymously to Miss Marple. The Iron Curtain is falling. She pressed her gloved hand over her handbag, where she kept the torn scrap of Elmswood's note. Whatever he had discovered, it had frightened powerful men, and frightened men often left dangerous shadows behind them. Brussels was only the first step. Her destination lay further east, in a Berlin now cut into zones, like pieces of a fractured mirror. Berlin greeted Miss Marple with a silence that felt unnatural for such a once vibrant city. Streets were half rubble, half repair. Children played near collapsed walls, while soldiers from 4 different nations walked past one another without speaking. American, British, French, and Soviet uniforms formed a patchwork of alliances that felt more like suspicion than cooperation. With her gentle manner, Miss Marple visited a small British administrative office to make inquiries about Professor Elmswood. To her mild surprise, a young officer recognized the name. "Oh yes, ma'am," he said, lowering his voice politely. "We received word that he may have traveled through Berlin a few months ago. A meeting, apparently. Something to do with post-war scientific committees." "Scientific committees?" Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, ma'am. The Soviets were particularly interested. They've been gathering scientists, Germans too, moving them east for research." Miss Marple felt a chill. Elmswood's stolen research, the men she overheard in London, it all pointed in one direction. "Do you know where he stayed?" she asked. The officer nodded. "A boarding house near the old university district. But," he hesitated, "people who stay there tend to vanish if someone else wants them more." Miss Marple thanked him and left, walking slowly toward the district. The air carried a strange hush, as if every wall, every alley, every broken streetlight was quietly listening. She felt eyes upon her, not hostile yet, but curious, evaluating. The city, she realized, was no longer simply rebuilding. It was dividing, and in the cracks of division, the truth was hiding. The boarding house was wedged between 2 half-bombed buildings. A faded sign hung crookedly, and an elderly German woman opened the door with weary suspicion. But Miss Marple had encountered many such wary souls in village lanes. Her warm politeness softened the woman's caution. "Yes," the woman whispered, "Professor Elmswood stayed here. A kind gentleman, nervous, always looking over his shoulder." She pointed toward a narrow staircase. "Room 3, but it has been empty for months." Miss Marple ascended the stairs, her cane tapping softly on the old wood. Room 3 was untouched, as if preserved by time. A thin layer of dust covered the table, the wardrobe, and the window ledge, yet there were traces, faint but unmistakable, that told a story. A burned match near the Weesterbin, a single shoelace under the bed, a faint scent of pipe tobacco, not the English type, a loose floorboard. Miss Marple knelt and lifted the board gently. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle. She opened it slowly. At the top was a map of Europe, divided into influence zones. But beneath the map were hurried notes in Elmswood's handwriting. A burned match near the Weesterbin, a single shoelace under the bed, a faint scent of pipe tobacco, not the English type, a loose floorboard. Miss Marple knelt and lifted the board gently. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle. She opened it slowly. At the top was a map of Europe, divided into influence zones. But beneath the map were hurried notes in Elmswood's handwriting. Miss Marple did not panic. Years of solving crimes had taught her that fear clouds one's ability to observe. Instead, she stood up calmly, brushed off her coat, and opened the door. A man in a dark Soviet officer's coat stood at the end of the corridor. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. Too sharp. "You should not be in that room," he said in accented English. Miss Marple gave a soft smile. "Oh dear, I had permission from the landlady. I am merely checking on a friend who once stayed here." The man stepped closer. "Many visitors come looking for old guests. They never find what they seek." Miss Marple tilted her head. "That is often because they look in the wrong place, wouldn't you say?" He did not smile. "Berlin is dangerous for those who ask questions, as is any place where truth is unwelcome," she replied gently. For a moment the corridor seemed to hold its breath. Then he spoke, voice low. "Your Professor Elmswood. He knew things he should not have known. If you keep searching, you may follow him where he has gone." With that, he turned sharply and descended the stairs. Miss Marple waited until his footsteps vanished before returning to the room to gather her thoughts. She had now confirmed two things. Elmswood had been here, and he had been watched, not only by British officials, but by Soviet intelligence as well. The Cold War's first shadows were longer than she imagined. That evening, Miss Marple sat in a small cafe lit by a single flickering bulb. Around her, Berliners spoke softly in German, Russian, English, and French, a city stitched together by uneasy alliances and quiet rivalries. Snow tapped gently at the window. She placed Elmswood's recovered paper on the table. It matched perfectly with the torn scrap she had found in London. Together, they formed a chilling truth. Elmswood had uncovered early intelligence about how Europe would be divided, controlled, influenced, not through open war, but through pressure, ideology, and science. His research, whatever it was, had become a threat to someone. But Miss Marple felt there was more. The Soviet officer's warning had not sounded merely threatening. It had sounded reluctant, almost protective, as if he too feared something larger than his own orders. She wrote in her notebook, "Elmswood, last seen in Berlin, possibly taken east, must learn what research he possessed and why it endangered him." Outside, the wind grew colder and the streets emptied. Miss Marple rose, fastening her buttons. "The Iron Curtain," she murmured, "is not just a line across Europe. It is a veil drawn across truth," and she was determined to lift that veil, wherever it led. Her next step lay deeper east, and deeper into the shadows of the Cold War. Chapter 3. The Berlin Blockade, 1948–49. 2 years had passed since Miss Marple first stepped into the shattered streets of Berlin. But the city had changed in ways she could never have imagined. Now, in 1948, Berlin was no longer simply divided, it was strangled. The Soviets had abruptly cut all road, rail, and water routes into West Berlin, leaving over 2 million civilians trapped. Food, coal, medicine, everything had been blocked. Miss Marple arrived on a cold June morning, stepping out of a British military jeep as aircraft roared overhead like restless giants. Endless planes, American, British, French, thundered through the sky, carrying supplies into the starving city. The Berlin airlift had begun. A young pilot named Peter Grant greeted her. He looked barely older than 25, with fatigue under his eyes and a determined steadiness in his posture. "You chose quite the time to return, ma'am," he said with a tired smile as they walked toward Tempelhof Airport. "I rarely choose the timing," Miss Marple replied gently. "Mysteries, I find, do not wait for convenience." Peter nodded. "We fly day and night. Coal, flour, medicine, whatever we can carry. But there have been incidents, she echoed softly. He lowered his voice. 3 all involving planes carrying sensitive documents, and someone tampered with ground equipment last week. Miss Marple felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Sabotage, and sabotage meant someone feared what might reach the city, or what might leave it. The shadow of Professor Elmswood stretched further than she had ever expected. Tempelhof Airport was a hive of motion. Engines roared, mechanics shouted, paperwork rustled through the wind, and pilots ran on cold coffee and determination. Miss Marple found herself observing the smallest details: a bent fuel cap, a nervous mechanic, a clipboard missing a page. Peter led her to one of the American C-47 cargo planes. "This one nearly went down 3 nights ago," he explained, opening the cockpit door. The pilot swore the instruments were working when he took off. 10 minutes into the flight, everything malfunctioned. Miss Marple stepped inside, eyes narrowing as she studied the instrument panel. The wires behind the dashboard were a maze of colors and metal, but she noticed something peculiar: a strand of wire carefully cut and reattached with a different, mismatched screw. "Someone wanted it to fail," she murmured. Peter nodded grimly. "The Americans think it's Soviet interference. The Soviets think it's Western propaganda." "And what do you think?" Miss Marple asked. He hesitated. "I think someone inside the city doesn't want certain flights to succeed." She found a second clue near the pilot's seat, a scrap of paper wedged between the floor panels. Carefully unfolding it, she revealed a fragment of typed words. "Research must not reach them. Stop the transfers before it escalates. Use the blockade." Her heart quickened. The same mysterious research tied to Professor Elmswood, the same unseen hands pulling strings. Peter frowned as she handed him the note. "What research? And who wrote this?" "That," Miss Marple said softly, "is precisely what we must discover." Miss Marple believed that information often lingered in places people abandoned. So that evening, she walked into the old university district, a place now half ruined, half haunted by memory. Snow crunched beneath her shoes as she approached a broken building where Elmswood had once lectured. Inside, a lone figure stood in the dim light of a lantern. Miss Marple immediately recognized him, the Soviet officer from 2 years earlier. He turned, surprise flickering across his eyes. "You should not be here, Mrs. Marple." "On the contrary," she replied calmly, "I believe this is exactly where I should be." The officer sighed. His face looked older now, worn by political weight. "Berlin is a battlefield without bullets, and you walk in the middle of it. Perhaps because the mystery I follow also walks here." He studied her carefully. "Elmswood indeed," she whispered, "and the research he carried." The officer hesitated, then walked toward a broken window, staring into the dark city. "Your professor knew too much. He saw how the world would divide. He had information on German scientists, those who worked on the atomic program. Both sides wanted them, and he was caught between them," Miss Marple asked. The officer nodded slowly. "But that is not all. He had discovered something far more dangerous, the beginning of a strategy to weaponize information, propaganda, espionage, manipulation of fear, a war fought in shadows rather than trenches." Miss Marple felt a chill. "And is he alive?" The officer's silence was answer enough. Before she could ask more, footsteps echoed outside. The officer extinguished the lantern. "They are watching," he whispered. "If you search further, do so quietly. They will not hesitate to silence you." And he disappeared into the night like a ghost escaping pursuit. Miss Marple stood alone in the ruins, understanding now that she was chasing not just a disappearance, but the blueprint of a new kind of war. Later that night, Miss Marple returned to Tempelhof Airport. Planes still thundered overhead, their wings glistening under the icy moonlight. Supplies were stacked like fragile hope on the cold tarmac. She noticed a solitary figure crouching beside the landing lights crucial for guiding aircraft in the dark. The figure held a wrench, turning something silently. Miss Marple stepped closer. "That is a dangerous place to be tampering with machinery, dear." The figure jolted, dropping the wrench. It was not a Soviet officer, nor a German civilian. It was an American technician, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "Ma'am, please," he stammered, fear flooding his eyes. "You were altering the alignment of the lights," Miss Marple said calmly. "If a pilot landed even slightly off course, it would be fatal." The man trembled. "You don't understand. I'm under orders." "Whose orders?" He swallowed. "I can't say. They told me the blockade must hold, that certain documents cannot fall into the wrong hands, that some planes mustn't land." "Which planes?" she pressed. "Anything labeled scientific cargo." Miss Marple felt her heartbeat quicken. The conspiracy was no longer local. It crossed borders, uniforms, loyalties. Someone was directing sabotage within every side of the city. And what would happen, Miss Marple asked softly, if the truth behind these acts were revealed? He looked down. "This blockade isn't just politics. It's a power struggle for knowledge." Miss Marple nodded gently. "And knowledge, my dear, is the most troublesome weapon of all." By the next morning, Miss Marple had pieced together enough clues to see the larger pattern. The Berlin blockade was not simply a Soviet attempt to choke the West, nor was the airlift merely a humanitarian effort. Beneath both lay a hidden war, a race to control scientific research, information networks, and the minds of those who would shape the future. Professor Elmswood had discovered the beginning of this silent war. He had tried to warn the world, and he had paid the price. Miss Marple sat at a small makeshift desk inside a hangar, reviewing her notes. Sabotage from both sides, stolen scientific documents, a dead scientist in the ruins, a Soviet officer who feared the coming storm, and Elmswood's final message: it will begin here in Berlin. The blockade, she realized, was the perfect smokescreen. Amid starvation and crisis, hidden agendas could move freely. But one question remained. Who was orchestrating the sabotage from behind the curtain? Miss Marple stood, fastening her coat. The next stage of her journey awaited beyond Berlin, deeper into the Cold War, where espionage turned into an art form and truth became a luxury. She whispered to herself, "If the world insists on dividing, then I must follow the cracks." And with quiet determination, she stepped into the rising roar of aircraft, ready for whatever chapter the Cold War would reveal next. Chapter 4: The Nuclear Puzzle, 1950s. St. Mary Mead was the sort of village where important news rarely arrived, except when the world was changing. And on a soft spring morning in 1950, Miss Marple heard a knock on her cottage door that carried the weight of an entire decade. A young man stood outside, tall, nervous, wearing a dark coat more suited to London than the countryside. He introduced himself quietly. "My name is Dr. Edwin Clark. I work in atomic research for the British government. I was told," he hesitated, studying her face, "I was told you might understand something others do not." Miss Marple invited him in with her usual warmth, offering tea and a chair by the fireplace. Dr. Clark unfolded a set of papers, sketches of early nuclear reactors, mathematical diagrams, and notes marked confidential. "Ma'am," he began, "Professor Elmswood worked with us before he disappeared. But now I believe someone is continuing his work without authorization, and they are using it to destabilize relations between East and West." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. You mean his research survived? Dr. Clark nodded. Yes, and recently, someone died protecting it. He slid a photo across the table. A scientist lying lifeless on the floor of a small laboratory. No signs of struggle, no stolen equipment. But Miss Marple saw something others likely missed. A faint smear of graphite dust on the man's wrist, a sign of manual note-taking, not done with modern ink pens. Was he working on a reactor model? She asked softly. Dr. Clark blinked. How did you know? Because, dear, she replied calmly, knowledge often kills long before weapons do. The Cold War's deadliest mystery had come knocking right at her cottage door. Within 2 days, Miss Marple and Dr. Clark were walking through the stone archways of Oxford University. The air smelled of libraries, old wood, and minds at work. But beneath the intellectual calm lay something darker. The deceased scientist, Dr. Samuel Reed, had worked here in a restricted underground lab. A stern security officer unlocked the heavy door leading below ground. No photographs, no notes leave this room. The laboratory was stark. Steel tables, radiation meters, chalkboards covered in complex formulas. But Miss Marple noticed the human details. A half-eaten apple, a sweater hung neatly on a chair, a personal diary tucked under a physics journal. She opened the diary gently. Reed had written about increased pressure from unnamed officials. He mentioned foreign inquiries, scientific recruitment attempts, and one chilling line. Elmswood's predictions were right. Knowledge is becoming a weapon. Miss Marple moved slowly through the room, stopping at a chalkboard with a partially erased diagram of neutron behavior. She traced one symbol lightly with her finger. This, she said, is not a bomb design. It's an energy model. Something intended for peace. Dr. Clark's face paled. Exactly. Reed believed nuclear research could prevent war, not fuel it. But someone wants to twist the narrative. Miss Marple picked up a discarded glove. The fingertips were stained with dark powder, not reactor dust, but ink, the kind used in printing. Someone, she murmured, has been copying his findings, and passing them to whom? Clark whispered. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She remembered the Soviet officer in Berlin warning her. He knew too much. Elmswood had uncovered the political weaponization of knowledge. Reed had tried to continue peaceful research. Both had been marked. She turned to Clark. We must find out who is collecting this information, and why they want to provoke fear instead of clarity. The Cold War was no longer a distant conflict. It was unfolding in laboratories, lecture halls, and silent corridors. That afternoon, Dr. Clark took Miss Marple to a lecture hall where Dr. Reed had last spoken publicly. Students still whispered about him, a man who believed nuclear science could stabilize the world rather than destroy it. As Miss Marple examined the podium, she spotted an unusual scratch near the microphone. Most people would overlook it, but she recognized a mark left by a concealed recording device. She leaned closer. Someone recorded his lecture. Clark exhaled sharply. For political reasons, or espionage, she replied calmly. In times of fear, information becomes currency. They searched the backstage area and soon discovered a small storage cupboard. Inside, papers had been stuffed behind a crate, copies of Reed's lecture notes, diagrams of nuclear applications, and correspondence between him and another scientist. A name appeared repeatedly, Dr. Anton Krylov. Clark's expression changed. Krylov was a Soviet physicist who defected 2 years ago, but no one knows where he is now. Miss Marple tapped the papers thoughtfully. Wherever he is still working, and he has access to both sides of this conflict. A sudden sound echoed through the corridor. Footsteps, hurried, approaching. Miss Marple motioned Clark to stay silent. A figure passed quickly, clutching a briefcase. His coat bore no insignia, but his stance was unmistakably that of a trained agent. Miss Marple recognized him instantly, the Soviet officer she had met twice before. But this time his face was different, older, more determined, burdened by something heavy. He stopped at the end of the corridor, as if sensing her presence. For a moment their eyes met. Then he slipped into the shadows and vanished. "He is not your enemy," she whispered. "Not yet." Clark stared at her. If he's not the one stealing research, then who is? Miss Marple looked again at the name Krolov. "Someone caught between worlds," she said. "Someone who benefits from fear on both sides." That evening, Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit university courtyard, her notebook resting on her lap. Clark paced anxiously. "What if this research leaks?" he asked. "A misinterpreted model could start an arms race faster than any weapon test." Miss Marple nodded calmly. "Fear, dear boy, often outruns facts." As she studied reads, copied notes, a pattern emerged, not in the formulas themselves, but in the order they had been duplicated. Whoever copied them understood enough physics to choose the diagrams that appeared threatening while omitting the ones that explained peaceful intent. "They want to portray this as hostile," Miss Marple concluded. "Something dangerous. Something that Western scientists intend to use aggressively." Clark swallowed. "Propaganda, yes," she replied softly. "Effective, terrifying propaganda." A rustle sounded behind them. The Soviet officer stepped from the shadows, breathing hard. "You must stop looking," he said urgently. "There are forces neither of our nations can control." Miss Marple rose slowly. "You fear the consequences, not the truth." He hesitated. Dr. Reed's death was no accident. Krolov's agents wanted his research. They succeeded. Clark shook with anger. "Then where is Krolov now?" The officer glanced around nervously. "Geneva, preparing to release a distorted version of Reed's findings, enough to push both sides into escalation." Miss Marple's heart tightened. "And Elmswood?" she asked quietly. The officer's eyes softened with regret. He refused to cooperate. The truth cost him his life. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. By dawn, Miss Marple knew what must be done. Reed had died to protect knowledge meant for peace. Elmswood had died warning of the coming shadow war. Now Dr. Krolov intended to twist their legacies into fuel for global fear. She packed her notebook, tightened her coat, and stood ready. "Geneva," she said firmly. "That is where the truth will either be saved or weaponized." Clark nodded, determination overtaking his fear. "We will stop him." But Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, dear, you must ensure the scientific truth is preserved. I must ensure the human motives are revealed." Their paths were connected, but different. As they left Oxford, Miss Marple reflected on the strange evolution of war. Once fought with armies, now fought with knowledge, scientists, and secrets. A new kind of battlefield, a new kind of detective work, she murmured as the train whistle echoed through the dawn light. Humanity now fears not the soldier, but the idea. With that, Miss Marple stepped forward into the next chapter of the Cold War. Toward Geneva. Toward Krolov. And toward the unraveling of the nuclear puzzle that threatened to reshape the world. Chapter 5. Spies in the Shadow. Geneva had always been a peaceful city, a place of diplomacy and quiet lakeside calm. But as Miss Marple stepped off the train in late autumn of 1952, she sensed tension simmering beneath its polished surface. Diplomats hurried through the station with nervous briefcases, and men in identical grey suits pretended not to watch one another. Dr. Clark had gone ahead to secure access to scientific archives. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had her own mission to find Dr. Anton Kroloff, the physicist whose manipulation of nuclear research threatened to push East and West into deeper mistrust. Her contact, an MI6 field officer named Robert Holden, greeted her near the platform. He was polite and clearly baffled that headquarters had asked him to assist an elderly lady from St. Mary Mead. "Ma'am," he said cautiously, "Geneva is flooded with agents right now. British, American, French, and the Soviets have half the lakeside cafes under surveillance." "Oh, that must be terribly inconvenient for them," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "Poor men, always watching, never noticing." Halden blinked. "Noticing what?" "That the most important clues hide in plain sight," she said, sweeping past him toward the exit. He followed helplessly. As they walked toward the city center, Miss Marple saw the first sign of trouble. A man in a brown coat trailing them at an exact, careful distance. She whispered without looking back, "Your follower is dreadfully obvious, dear." Holden turned, startled. "KGB." "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "Someone more nervous." She knew that the shadows in Geneva were not cast by buildings, but by fear, and fear had many employers. That afternoon, Holden led Miss Marple to a discreet café near the Palais des Nations, the sort of place where diplomats met for coffee that tasted far more like negotiation. Miss Marple sat quietly, observing every gesture around her, the way a woman stirred her tea too slowly, the way a man in a hat read a newspaper without turning the page, the way a waiter paused near a table long enough to overhear. Halden leaned forward. "Our sources say Kroloff is preparing a presentation, one that will portray Western nuclear research as aggressive. If he succeeds, it will justify Soviet escalation." Miss Marple nodded. "And this presentation, is it stored in that briefcase he carries everywhere?" Halden frowned. "We're not certain where he keeps it." Miss Marple glanced at the door, where Dr. Kroloff entered the cafe with 2 escorts. He sat at a corner table, placing a black leather briefcase beside him. "There," she said simply. Holden stared. "How did you?" "It is the only briefcase in the room polished to a shine," she replied, "and the only one he keeps within touching distance." Kroloff ordered coffee, opened his notebook, and began writing equations with an intensity that made the air feel colder. "Watch carefully," Miss Marple whispered to Holden. Within minutes, a waiter approached Kroloff's table. He placed a tray down, knocked the sugar bowl over by accident, and apologized profusely. During the commotion, his foot nudged the briefcase ever so slightly, sliding it closer to his own leg. A classic distraction technique. But now something caught Miss Marple's sharp eye. The waiter's shoes were military issue, not restaurant standard, and the briefcase he attempted to slide away was subtly different in stitching from the original. "A switch," she murmured. As the waiter turned to leave with the swapped briefcase, Miss Marple rose with surprising speed. "Oh dear," she said, stumbling lightly and perfectly intentionally into his path. The briefcase slipped from his hand, hit the floor, and burst partially open. Inside were not scientific documents, but surveillance photos and coded messages. The waiter paled. Holden lunged forward. "MI6, he shouted. The Soviet agents at the far table also rose. The cafe erupted into chaos. But in the confusion, Miss Marple calmly picked up the original briefcase, still resting safely beside Kroloff's chair, and handed it to him. You dropped this, she said gently. Kroloff stared at her, stunned. You know nothing, he hissed. On the contrary, she replied. I know that the truth inside that case is dangerous only when twisted by frightened men. He froze. For a moment, Miss Marple saw not a villain, but a scientist caught between survival and ideology. Later that evening, Holden and Miss Marple regrouped in a safe house overlooking Lake Geneva. Papers recovered from the spy waiter lay spread on the table, coded cables showing plans to sabotage scientific conferences, manipulate research, interpretation, and create political panic. Holden ran a hand through his hair. This is bigger than anything MI6 anticipated. Half of Europe's scientific community is being monitored. Miss Marple examined a coded sheet, noting the repetition of a particular name, Project Solaris. What is this? She asked. Holden hesitated. A rumored Soviet operation. The goal is to portray Western nuclear research as threatening, even if it isn't. And Kroloff, she asked quietly. He's their scientific voice. If he presents Reed's distorted research publicly, the Soviets can claim the West is preparing a nuclear strike. Miss Marple felt a stab of sorrow. Reed had believed knowledge could prevent war. Now his work was being twisted into the opposite. Holden sighed. We need Kroloff's notes. If we can prove they're falsified. Miss Marple touched his arm lightly. Proof alone won't stop fear. You must expose the motive, not only the method. He frowned. Meaning. Fear flourishes when people misunderstand one another, she said. Reveal that misunderstanding, and the weapon loses its power. At that moment, someone knocked at the safe house door. A slow, deliberate knock. Holden drew his pistol. Miss Marple shook her head. He is not here to harm us. It was the Soviet officer, the same man who had warned her in Berlin. His face was pale, his voice low. They know, he said. They know you disrupted the switch, and they will not forgive it. Holden stepped forward. Why help us? The officer's eyes flickered with pain. Because the truth should not be buried under fear. Elmswood believed that. Reed believed that. And you? Miss Marple asked softly. He hesitated. I am tired of serving lies dressed as patriotism. He placed an envelope on the table. Inside were pages copied from Kroloff's false presentation, proofs of manipulation, exaggeration, and deliberate distortion. Kroloff is not your enemy, the officer said quietly. He is being forced. If he refuses, his family will suffer. Miss Marple closed her eyes. Fear, again, shaping the world. Where will he present this research? She asked. Tomorrow, the officer replied. At the Scientific Peace Forum. Miss Marple stood. Then tomorrow, she said, we must save his truth. The next morning, the Scientific Peace Forum was buzzing with dignitaries, reporters, and delegates from around the world. Every camera was ready. Every headline had been drafted in advance. Soviet scientist exposes Western nuclear threat. New evidence of Western aggression. Miss Marple, Holden, and the Soviet officer slipped into the auditorium. Kroloff stood backstage, pale, trembling, clutching his briefcase. Miss Marple approached him gently. Dr. Kroloff, she said. Fear has trapped you, but the world deserves truth, not terror. He looked away. You do not understand. I do, she whispered. They are using the work of dead men to justify the next war. Kroloff's hands shook. If I refuse, my family. Miss Marple placed her hand on his. And if you proceed, millions of families may face war. The auditorium lights dimmed. Kroloff walked onto the stage. Miss Marple watched, breath held as he opened his briefcase. For a moment, he looked out at the sea of expectant faces, politicians, generals, scientists. Then he closed the briefcase again, slowly, deliberately, and said, "I refuse to speak lies." Gasps filled the hall. He stepped away from the podium. Chaos erupted instantly. Delegates shouting, cameras flashing, Soviet escorts rushing toward him. But Holden intercepted them, presenting the evidence collected from the Soviet officer. Journalists swarmed, capturing the confrontation. The narrative shifted in seconds. Fear had been exposed. An exposed fear loses power. Later, as evening settled over Lake Geneva, Miss Marple stood beside the water, watching the silver ripples stretch toward the mountains. Holden joined her, breathless. "Krolov has requested asylum. The Soviets are furious, but the press already knows everything." Miss Marple nodded softly. One truth rarely ends a conflict, but it can delay a lie. Holden looked at her curiously. "You know, MI6 has operatives half your age with half your insight." "Oh dear," she said with a polite laugh. "That sounds dreadfully inefficient." He smiled. "What comes next?" Miss Marple looked out over the still lake. "The Cold War will continue," she said. "But now we know its greatest weapon is not bombs, it is fear." She turned to him, her eyes filled with quiet resolve. "And fear," she added, "can be understood, and therefore defeated." As she walked back toward the city lights, Miss Marple knew the shadows had only begun to shift. More mysteries lay ahead, darker, deeper, and woven into the very fabric of global tension. But she also knew this. Wherever fear shaped the world, a detective's clarity was needed, and Miss Marple would be there. Chapter 6: The Cuban Mystery, 1962. It had been 10 years since Geneva, yet the Cold War had only sharpened its edges. Miss Marple, now in her late 70s, lived a quiet life in St. Mary Mead, or as quiet as life could be for someone who understood global secrets better than most diplomats. Then, on a warm October afternoon in 1962, she received a letter. No signature, no return address, only a single, haunting sentence. "The world stands on the brink again, and you once saw the truth behind their weapons." Inside was a plane ticket to Washington, D.C. Miss Marple sighed. "Oh dear, not again." But she went. In Washington, she was met by an old acquaintance, Robert Holden, now high-ranking in British intelligence. His face looked older, sharper, burdened with secrets. "Miss Marple," he greeted, "we're in the gravest crisis since the war. American surveillance planes have photographed Soviet missiles in Cuba. Nuclear missiles." Miss Marple nodded calmly. "And fear, once again, threatens to decide the world's future." Holden leaned closer. "Someone sent you that letter because they believe you can help identify the human element. There is more happening than the world sees. Messages intercepted from Havana suggest internal conflict and possible sabotage." "You think another manipulated narrative is being constructed," she said softly. "Yes, and we need someone who understands motives, not just intelligence reports." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Then we must go to Cuba." Holden hesitated. "It's dangerous." "My dear," she said gently, "the truth always is." And so Miss Marple headed into one of the tensest moments in human history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Havana was hot, humming and humming with fear. Soldiers stood at every corner. Trucks rumbled through narrow streets. Radios crackled with speeches about imperialism, revolution, and the threat of invasion. Miss Marple, dressed inconspicuously in a floral Caribbean blouse provided by Halden's contacts, walked through the bustling city with quiet observation. Her guide was an American intelligence officer named Daniel. Myers com/alert, trying not to reveal how nervous he truly was. "Ma'am," he explained as they moved through an outdoor market, "our sources say there's a faction inside the Cuban military unhappy with Soviet missiles on the island. They think they can manipulate events to gain power, even if it risks war." Miss Marple examined a vendor's basket of citrus fruits. Ambition is often more dangerous than ideology. Myers nodded. "We also intercepted a coded message about a visitor from Europe who is expected to influence negotiations. We thought that it might be me." She finished. "We weren't sure, but someone brought you here for a reason." Miss Marple looked around. She noticed a man pretending to read a newspaper upside down, another pretending to adjust fruit baskets while watching their every move. "The city is full of watchers," she murmured. "Everyone is watching everyone," Myers replied. "Cuba, America, Soviets, rebels, and now you." From the corner of her eye, Miss Marple spotted a shadow slipping behind a tobacco stall, fast, purposeful. She touched Myers' arm. "Someone wishes to speak without being seen." They followed discreetly. Behind the stall, hidden from the soldier's sight, stood a familiar figure. The Soviet officer. His hair was grayer now, his posture heavier, but the quiet sorrow in his eyes was unchanged. "You again," Myers said, startled. Miss Marple stepped forward. "You sent the letter." He nodded. "The truth is being strangled, and someone intends to ensure Cuba becomes a spark for war." The Soviet officer led Miss Marple and Myers to a quiet back room in an abandoned cigar factory. Dust floated in golden sunlight cutting through broken shutters. It was far from soldiers' ears, far from diplomacy's stage. "I am not here for Moscow," he said quietly. "Not anymore. But there are those in Havana and Moscow who plan to push both nations toward confrontation." Myers frowned. "You mean sabotage?" "Yes," the officer replied. "A Cuban, General Arturo Menendez, believes he can force America to back down by provoking a conflict. A small one. He wants to fire a missile without authorization, just enough to demonstrate power." Miss Marple stiffened. "A single spark," she whispered, "could burn the world." The officer nodded gravely. "Menendez also has Soviet officers supporting him, rogue men who believe Khrushchev is too cautious. And the visitor from Europe they expect?" Miss Marple asked. The officer's eyes met hers. "Dr. Anton Krolov." Miss Marple felt her heart beat slow with dread. "Krolov survived," she murmured. "Yes. The Geneva exposure saved his life, but ruined his career. Now Menendez uses him to justify technical claims about missile capability. He never wanted this. He is being coerced." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Krolov had been a man trapped between loyalty and conscience. Now he was trapped again. But this time, the stakes were what. Myers spoke urgently. "We need to find Krolov, expose Menendez, and stop any unauthorized launch." The Soviet officer nodded. "Tonight, at the San Carlos fortress, Menendez plans a demonstration." Miss Marple tightened her grip on her handbag. "Then we must get there before he turns a crisis into history's greatest tragedy." Night draped Havana in shadows as Miss Marple, Myers, and the Soviet officer approached La Cabana fortress. Searchlights swept the grounds. Guards paced with rifles. Waves crashed against the cliffside far below. "Keep close," the Soviet officer whispered. "If Menendez sees us, he will assume we are exactly what we are." Miss Marple finished. "A threat to his ambition." Inside the fortress courtyard, Cuban officers gathered around a missile transporter. Under dim lamps stood Dr. Kroloff, thinner, pale eyes holding a familiar despair. Miss Marple stepped forward. "Kroloff," she said, softly. He turned sharply, shock flooding his face. "You? Here, how?" "No time," she whispered. "You must not help them." He swallowed hard. "They will kill my sister if I refuse." Miss Marple's voice softened. "And they will kill millions if you comply." Before he could respond, a booming voice filled the courtyard. General Menendez. Tall, charismatic, dangerous. A man who believed history bent to ambition. "So," he said, walking closer, "our foreign guests arrive." Myers tensed. The Soviet officer reached for a concealed weapon. Menendez raised a hand. "No need. Tonight is not about violence. It is about power." He pointed to the missile shell behind him. One demonstration shot into international waters. The Americans retreat. The Soviets gain respect. Cuba becomes untouchable. Miss Marple stepped forward, unafraid. "General, you misunderstand power. It is not shown through fear. It is shown through restraint." Menendez laughed. "Restraint is for the weak." "And destruction," Miss Marple replied, "is for the foolish." For a moment, silence hung. Then the alarm bell rang. Soldiers rushed. Something had triggered the launch pre-sequence. Myers shouted, "They're activating the system." Menendez smirked. "History demands courage, Senora." Miss Marple looked at Kroloff, trembling, terrified. "Kroloff," she said firmly, "you know the system. Can you stop it?" He hesitated, then nodded. Chaos engulfed the fortress. Kroloff dashed to the control panel, ripping open its metal casing. Myers covered him, shouting orders. The Soviet officer restrained a rebel lieutenant, attempting to pull the emergency override. Miss Marple stood calmly in the center of the storm, her voice slicing through panic. "Look at this madness," she cried. "One button, one mistake, and the world ends. For what? Pride, ambition. A moment in history's footnotes." Kroloff shouted, "I need 2 minutes." Menendez lunged toward him. The Soviet officer intercepted, tackling him to the ground. Miss Marple stepped beside Kroloff. "Breathe, dear. You know the truth. Use it." With trembling hands, Kroloff rewired the panel, cutting power to the ignition line. The missile lights went dark. Silence fell like a tidal wave. Menendez screamed in rage. Soldiers hesitated, not wanting a war triggered by one man's madness. Myers stepped forward. "General Menendez, you are under arrest for unauthorized military provocation." The soldiers lowered their rifles, not for Myers, but for the truth. Menendez was dragged away, cursing the world he failed to control. Kroloff collapsed to his knees, shaking. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You saved the world today, not with brilliance, but with courage." The Soviet officer looked at her quietly. Fear again tried to win. "But it did not," she said softly. "Because fear, dear gentleman, only rules when good people remain silent." As dawn rose over Havana, soft gold washing away the night's shadows, Miss Marple knew the crisis was far from over. The Cold War would continue, fear would return, but so would she. Wherever the shadows grew darkest, Miss Marple would follow, understanding, unraveling, revealing. Because sometimes one wise old woman could prevent a war. Chapter 7: The Silent Battles, 1970s. The 1970s brought new music, new fashions, new governments, yet, underneath the glitter and progress, the Cold War continued to simmer like a pot left unattended on a stove. The Cuban Missile Crisis had been a moment of terror, But it had not ended the deeper conflict. Instead, it pushed the superpowers to seek new battlegrounds, quiet ones far from their own borders. Miss Marple, now well into her 80s, lived her days peacefully in St. Mary Mead, but she read the newspapers closely. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, the Middle East, so many distant places where two great powers clashed indirectly. Proxy wars, they called them. Battles fought by smaller nations while the giants watched from afar. One morning in 1974, Miss Marple received a letter from Dr. Edwin Clark, now a respected advisor on international science and security. His handwriting revealed urgency. The conflict is shifting. Not open war, but hidden influence. I believe someone is manipulating these proxy battles for purposes beyond politics. Please meet me in London. Miss Marple sighed softly. Another shadow, she murmured. Another corner of fear. She travelled to London by train, wrapped in her blue coat and carrying her well-worn notebook. London's skyline had changed: glass buildings, new motorways, but human motives remained the same. At a quiet tea room near Westminster, Dr. Clark greeted her with visible relief. Miss Marple, he said, I fear the Cold War has entered a darker phase. Someone is using these proxy wars to test new methods: psychological manipulation, resource sabotage, misinformation. And intelligence believes the same architect behind the Cuban crisis has resurfaced. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Menendez. No, Clark replied. He died in prison. I mean someone else. Someone we thought had stepped away. Miss Marple felt her heart tighten. Krolov, she whispered. Clark nodded. Clark led Miss Marple to a secure office inside a sterile government building. On the wall hung a massive map of the world marked with red pinsage, representing a conflict, coup, sabotage attempt, or economic crisis linked to Cold War influence. But several pins were circled in blue instead of red. These, Clark explained, pointing to Angola, Laos, Ethiopia, Chile, and Yemen, are not typical proxy conflicts. Intelligence reports indicate mysterious disruptions, faulty weapons, misinterpreted messages, false diplomatic cables. Miss Marple studied the map. Clumsy actions. Not clumsy, Clark corrected. Deliberate. Someone is tampering with events to escalate tension unpredictably. Miss Marple traced her finger across the blue circles. Chaos, used as a weapon. Clark nodded gravely, and we traced one message. One coded transmission to a research institute in Eastern Europe, an institute where Dr. Anton Krolov is rumored to be working. Miss Marple's breath slowed. She remembered Krolov, brilliant, conflicted, frightened, a man used repeatedly by others, a man who had once stopped a global disaster. Clark leaned forward. We believe Krolov is either orchestrating this, or being forced again. And you wish, with all your resources, she said gently, for an old woman to tell you which. Clark smiled weakly. You understand people far better than any analyst. Miss Marple nodded. Very well. What is causing such desperately quiet, yet terribly loud battles? Her eyes shifted back to the map. In conflict, she murmured, people reveal their true motives. And motives, not weapons, betray the architect. Their first stop was Ethiopia, nation caught between revolutions, famine, and foreign interference. Miss Marple, accompanied by Clark and a local liaison named Salam Tadis, arrived in Addis Ababa, just as political unrest was ripping through the city. Salam briefed them inside a small cafe overlooking a crowded market. There was an explosion at a fuel depot last week, she explained quietly. Both sides blame each other. But witnesses say a foreign team tampered with the machinery days earlier. Clark frowned. Foreign, Soviet, American. Salam shook her head. No one knows. But the damage destabilized the region, and international powers began offering assistance. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully, creating chaos to force dependency. Salam looked at her in surprise. Yes, that is exactly what many fear. They visited the damaged depot, twisted metal, scorched walls, and a lingering smell of burnt fuel. Miss Marple examined the remains of a control panel. Among the ashes, she found something unusual, a fragment of a precision tool, finely machined, clearly foreign. This is not Ethiopian workmanship, she said, nor American, it is European. Clark examined it. Eastern European manufacturing, perhaps East German, Czech, or Soviet subcontractors. Miss Marple closed her fingers around the metal fragment. Kroloff's signature was never his ideas, she murmured. It was precision. This is not his sabotage. This is something done by those who once controlled him. Salam frowned, meaning Kroloff is involved, Miss Marple said softly, but unwillingly. This was meant to mimic his methods, to implicate him, or perhaps to push him deeper into their service. They left Ethiopia with more questions than answers, but with one certainty. Someone was weaponizing global instability. Their next destination was Chile, where political upheaval had reached a boiling point. Demonstrations filled the streets. Foreign agents moved like currents beneath the surface. On the second night in Santiago, Miss Marple found an envelope slipped under her hotel door. Inside, a single sentence in Kroloff's handwriting. They turned my equations into fire. Clark's hands trembled as he read it. He's alive, and he's reaching out. Miss Marple stared at the words. They carried deep despair, heavy guilt, and a plea for help. He is not orchestrating this, she said firmly. He is trapped in it. That evening, a contact arranged a meeting with an informant who had once worked with Eastern Bloc intelligence. They met in a dim warehouse, smelling of dust and sea air. The informant, a weary man with clouded eyes, whispered, "Kroloff is kept in an institute in Prague, not a prisoner, but not free. They use him to create formulas to justify intervention. They tell him it will prevent war, but they use it to spark small wars instead." Miss Marple closed her eyes. The silent battles. The man nodded. They call it Operation Equinox, testing reactions to controlled instability. Clark swore softly. They're using scientific models to predict political panic. Miss Marple rose from her chair. "Prague," she said. "We must go to Prague." Prague greeted them with winter fog and the muted clatter of trams passing through cobblestone streets. The institute where Kroloff was held stood at the edge of the city, an elegant, Baroque building, repurposed into a facility that housed both research and surveillance. Using forged credentials Clark had arranged, Miss Marple entered the institute posing as a harmless visiting librarian researching scientific archives. Few questioned her. Elderly women seldom appeared in spy reports. She walked the corridors slowly, observing scientists, guards, locked doors. Then she saw him, Dr. Anton Krolov, pale, wearing a rumpled coat and carrying documents close to his chest, as though protecting them from the world. She waited until he was alone in a small reading room. "Kroloff," she whispered. He jumped, eyes wide, then softened with recognition. "Miss Marple, why did you come?" "To understand what they've turned you into," she replied softly, "and to help you become yourself again." His eyes filled with despair. "They force me to model outcomes. They say it stabilizes the world, but every equation becomes a trigger somewhere far away. Miss Marple touched his arm gently. You are not the cause. You are the tool they misuse. Kroloff shook his head. No. Tonight they test another model. A coup in a small African state. They want to see how quickly panic spreads if communications fail. Miss Marple's voice turned firm. Then we must stop them. Clark arrived moments later with a plan. Together, they infiltrated the operations room. Miss Marple, using her calm presence to distract a guard while Clark disabled the communication triggers. Kroloff, with trembling hands, tore up the final set of equations. An alarm rang. Guards rushed in, but Kroloff stepped forward. I refuse, he said. No more. The guards hesitated, certain, surprised, questioning the chain of command. In that hesitation, Clark seized the moment. Using diplomatic leverage and proof of Operation Equinox, he informed superiors that Kroloff would be transferred under international protection. Miss Marple looked at Kroloff with quiet pride. You have chosen courage twice now, she said. He bowed his head. Thanks to you, I remembered what truth feels like. As they left Prague with Kroloff safely under escort, Miss Marple looked out at the winter-draped city. The silent battles would continue, but one man's freedom had shifted the balance, and somewhere in the shadows she sensed another storm forming. But she was ready, because truth, once found, could travel farther than war. Chapter 8: The Technology Race, 1980s. By the early 1980s, the world had changed again, but the Cold War had not disappeared. Instead, it had transformed. Superpowers no longer fought only through armies and spies. They now competed through technology. Computers hummed in government buildings, satellites circled silently overhead, and whispers of information warfare stirred among diplomats. Miss Marple, though well into her 90s, kept her mind sharper than ever. She read newspapers, scientific magazines, and even technology journals, despite confessing, I do prefer knitting patterns to microchips. One morning, she received a call from Dr. Edwin Clark. Miss Marple, he said urgently, there's been a death in Silicon Valley. A British scientist working on encryption technology was found dead in his laboratory. The Americans suspect Soviet involvement. But something feels off. Miss Marple listened quietly. And why? She asked. Do you feel the need to involve an old woman from St. Mary Mead? Clark sighed. Because the pattern fits the same string of events we've been following for decades. Distortion, manipulation, stolen research. A new kind of weapon is emerging, one made of data, not bombs. And I fear someone is orchestrating this the same way they once used Kroloff. Very well, she said. I will come. Thus Miss Marple boarded a plane to California, her first ever trip to America, determined to understand how technology had become the Cold War's newest battlefield. Silicon Valley surprised Miss Marple. It was nothing like the orderly villages and universities she was used to. It buzzed with youth, energy, ambition, computers humming in garages, entrepreneurs in denim jackets rushing between labs, ideas floating as fast as electrons. Dr. Clark met her outside a lab complex framed by palm trees. The victim, he said, was Dr. Henry Litton, a cryptographer developing a new form of secure communication. If his invention is misused, it could give one side a permanent advantage in espionage. Miss Marple nodded. And where was he found? In his office. No sign of struggle, door locked from inside. A locked room, she murmured. How very classic. Inside the lab, everything gleamed. Polished metal, glowing screens, paper stacks of algorithms and codes. Dr. Litton's desk held an overturned coffee mug, a flickering computer monitor, and a set of handwritten formulae. But Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the smallest details. Dust disturbed on the windowsill, a wire slightly bent, a folder pushed too far back. She knelt beside Litton's chair, noticing faint marks on the carpet. "This chair," she said, "has been moved recently. Hardly noticeable, but enough to align the body differently." Clark looked stunned, meaning Litton was moved after death. "I believe so," she said. Someone wanted to stage solitude. She turned to the computer. A message flashed repeatedly. "Access denied. Key required." Clark frowned. His encryption system. No one could access it without Litton's personal key. Miss Marple tapped the monitor lightly, which means someone attempted to. She moved toward a filing cabinet and opened the top drawer. Inside lay a small photograph of Litton with a group of international scientists, Americans, British, Japanese, and one face she recognized instantly. "Kroloff," Miss Marple whispered, "why are you here again?" Clark stared at the photograph in disbelief. Kroloff, but he's under international watch. He shouldn't be anywhere near American labs. Miss Marple studied the image. This photo is recent. His hair is grayer, but the eyes still troubled. They met with Litton's colleague, a young engineer named Samantha Hayes. She was brilliant, disheveled, and terrified. "I know Dr. Litton didn't kill himself," she said, voice shaking. "Someone wanted access to his algorithm. Someone who knew too much." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did Dr. Litton mention anything unusual?" Samantha hesitated. "A few weeks ago, he received a call from Europe. Afterward, he kept saying, 'They're shifting the battlefield again.' I thought he meant competition." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Clark. "The battlefield is shifting from territory to technology." Samantha continued. "He also said he'd met a brilliant Eastern European mathematician decades ago. Someone who regretted everything." "Kroloff," Clark muttered. Miss Marple touched Samantha's hand. "My dear, fear often silences people, but you must think carefully who visited Litton recently." Samantha swallowed. "A foreign delegation. They claimed to be investors. One man spoke little, but watched everything." Miss Marple nodded slowly, an observer. Looking not for investment, but for weaknesses, she stood. "We must find Kroloff." Their investigation took them across the United States. Following traces of Kroloff's movements, anonymously booked flights, half-raced hotel records, surveillance notes from both US and Soviet intelligence, it became clear that Kroloff was not working on behalf of a country. He was running from the same forces that had used him for decades. Their search finally led them to a quiet research retreat in Colorado, hidden among pine forests and mountain air, a place where scientists occasionally went to restore their minds, but could also hide from the world. Inside a small cabin, they found Krolovolder, frailer, but alive. His eyes widened as he saw Miss Marple. "You again," he whispered. "Why do you follow the path of shadows?" "Because," she said gently, "you leave pieces of yourself behind, and people die in those shadows." Kroloff sat heavily. "I tried to stop them. Litton contacted me, asking for advice on secure encryption. I warned him his system would attract predators. I urged him to stop." "Predators?" Clark asked. Kroloff nodded. "A new faction. Not Soviet, not American. A group exploiting the technology race for profit. They want algorithms, satellite codes, digital dominance. They do not care who wins or loses. Conflict is their marketplace." Miss Marple felt a cold clarity settle within her. So they killed Lytton, she said. Yes, Krolov whispered. To steal his key. Clark asked urgently, what about the encryption itself? Can they misuse it? If they acquire the master key, Krolov said, they can unlock communications worldwide. No government would trust another again. Miss Marple's voice sharpened. Then we must stop them. But first tell me why Lytton's chair was moved. Krolov lowered his eyes. Because he died facing the door. He saw his killer. Returning to Silicon Valley, Miss Marple revisited the lab with new purpose. She traced every detail with Krolov's revelations in mind. She approached the chair again. This chair was rotated, she said, to suggest Lytton was working quietly, but his final act was turning toward his killer. Clark asked, but who? Miss Marple walked toward the window, brushing her hand along the sill. Here, dust disturbed. Someone entered through the maintenance window. Safe for someone who knew the building. She inspected the photograph again. Samantha Hayes stood beside Lytton in the picture, and beside Krolov, Miss Marple whispered, the one person who had access to the lab at all hours, whose keycard never raised suspicion, and who knew the algorithm well enough to finish what the killers wanted. Clark stared. Samantha. Miss Marple nodded. Not a victim of fear, a partner of opportunity. They confronted Samantha in the lab. Her expression shifted instantly from shock to resignation. You don't understand, she whispered. The world was changing. Lytton was standing in the way of progress. His encryption could have reshaped Alliance's eye, just helped it fall into better hands. Killing, Miss Marple said softly, never leads to progress. Only two more shadows. Samantha lunged for the computer, but Clark intercepted her. Security restrained her as she screamed about a new global order. Miss Marple retrieved the missing encryption key from Samantha's pocket. Krolov later ensured the algorithm was safely dismantled. As Miss Marple prepared to leave Silicon Valley, Clark walked her to the airport. You've solved yet another piece of this Cold War, he said. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, dear. The Cold War solves itself through human motives. I merely uncover them. She looked out the window at glowing city lights. As long as ambition hides in the dark, she said, truth must learn to walk with a lantern. And with that, she returned to St. Mary, Mead knowing the Cold War's final chapters were still to come. Chapter 9. The Cracks in the Wall, 1989. By 1989, the Cold War was creaking under its own weight. Revolutions stirred across Eastern Europe, protests filled the streets of Poland and Hungary, and whispers grew louder. The world is changing. Miss Marple, now nearing 100, spent her morning tending to her roses when she noticed a visitor walking up the garden path, a man with a gentle limp and a familiar sadness in his eyes. Krolov, she greeted him warmly but with concern. My dear, you look as though you carry the whole world on your shoulders. He nodded, lowering himself onto a garden bench. The world I knew is falling apart, and perhaps that is good. But those who fear change will do anything to stop it. Miss Marple poured tea. Tell me what brings you. Krolov hesitated, then handed her a folder filled with photographs. Protests in East Germany, soldiers hesitating at checkpoints, citizens chanting for freedom. Berlin, he said. The wall is weakening. But certain officials, old hardliners, want to provoke violence to justify keeping the wall intact. Miss Marple studied the images. Fear, again. Yes, Krolov whispered. Fear of losing control. Fear of truth. And they intend to orchestrate an incident in Berlin that will halt the movement toward freedom. Miss Marple folded her hands. You want me to come to Berlin? Krylov looked at her with quiet desperation. You have always understood what others overlooked the human motive behind history. This time, the world may need your eyes once more. Miss Marple sighed softly. Then I suppose I must pack. And so, at almost 100 years old, Miss Marple prepared to witness the unraveling of one of history's greatest divisions. Berlin in November 1989 felt like a city holding its breath. Graffiti covered the wall in bright colors, faces, slogans, symbols of rebellion. Crowds gathered daily, singing, shouting, pressing closer to the concrete barrier that had separated families and futures for nearly 3 decades. Miss Marple arrived with Krylov and was met by Dr. Clark, who now worked with an international diplomatic team monitoring the tensions. Miss Marple, he said, embracing her gently, I cannot believe you're here again. But we need your mind more than ever. He led them to a safe flat overlooking a busy street where protesters gathered. There are rumors, Clark explained, that a staged shooting is planned, a false flag attack meant to terrify the protesters into retreat. If fear returns, the wall survives. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. History repeats when people refuse to learn. Krylov showed them intercepted notes messages from a rogue faction within the East German security forces. They call themselves the Custodians, he said. Men who believe collapse would mean betrayal of their nation. Miss Marple reviewed the notes. And they intend to manufacture an incident. Yes, Clark replied. A shot fired at the crowd from behind the wall, blamed on Western provocateurs. Miss Marple tapped the papers thoughtfully. But fear leaves patterns. Even lies require preparation. We must find where they intend to act. Outside, protesters chanted louder. The wall must go, Miss Marple whispered, and so must the fear. That evening, Miss Marple and Krylov walked along the perimeter of the wall, escorted discreetly by Clark. The air was cold, mist clinging to the old concrete like ghosts of the past. Watchtowers loomed overhead, some abandoned, others still manned. Miss Marple stopped suddenly, noticing one watchtower where a single silhouette remained unusually still. That man, she whispered, he is not observing, he is waiting. Clark followed her gaze. We've had reports of unauthorized personnel using certain towers, possibly part of the Custodians. Miss Marple studied the figure's posture. He's watching the crowd, not guarding the border, and he is positioned at the edge of 2 major protest routes, ideal for a staged provocation. Krylov nodded. This must be the site. As they watched, a black car approached the tower, stopping briefly. A man handed the guard a small package. Miss Marple's lips thinned. A weapon. Clark whispered urgently, we need proof. Miss Marple shook her head. Proof alone won't stop a bullet. We must prevent the act. They trailed the car from a safe distance, winding through dim East Berlin streets until it reached a quiet military storage facility. 2 more custodian officers met the driver inside. Krylov sighed. If we alert authorities, they may be part of the same faction. Miss Marple responded softly. Then we must appeal to someone whose motives differ. Who? Clark asked. The people, Miss Marple replied. The following night, tens of thousands of protesters gathered again. Miss Marple stood near the base of the wall, wrapped in a heavy coat, observing every detail, the shifting guards, the anxious movements of the custodian lookout, the crowd's growing tension. Krylov positioned himself near the watchtower. Clark moved through the crowd, alerting trusted activists on what to watch for. Miss Marple approached a group of protest organizers. My dears, she said gently, if the crowd stays directly beneath that tower, you are in danger. The leaders listened, confused. "There are men who wish to frighten you into silence," she explained. "If you disperse slightly and draw attention away from that tower, you deny them an easy opportunity." Within minutes, the protest shifted naturally, people spreading out, moving unpredictably, lessening the chance of a staged incident. But the custodians moved to. The man in the tower grew agitated, shouting into his radio. Miss Marple watched him carefully, her pulse steady. Suddenly, he raised the rifle. Miss Marple's voice sliced through the noise. Now, Krolov, Clark, and two activists triggered floodlights they had secretly arranged. Brilliant beams illuminated the tower. The protesters gasped. The shooter froze, caught in full public view. Reporters surged forward with cameras. Soldiers nearby turned toward the tower in confusion. The custodian faction's secrecy was shattered. Clark shouted into his radio, "Unauthorized armed action at Tower 14. Arrest the shooter." The crowd roared in outrage, not fear. Within minutes, East German authorities, embarrassed, pressured, and overwhelmed, moved in. The rogue shooter was detained. The custodian plot unraveled. Miss Marple closed her eyes in relief. "Light," she murmured, "is the eternal enemy of fear." The next morning, something extraordinary happened. News spread like wildfire. Officials announced new travel freedoms. Checkpoints opened. Crowds surged toward the wall. Miss Marple, Clark, and Krolov stood among them, watching history unfold. People climbed atop the wall, cheering, crying, embracing strangers. Soldiers did not stop them. Some even joined. Krolov wiped tears from his eyes. "I never thought I would see this." Miss Marple smiled softly. Walls built from fear crumble fastest when truth finally steps forward. Clark rested a hand on her shoulder. "You helped stop the spark that could have preserved this division for years." "No, dear," she said, "the people tore it down. I merely ensured no one stole their moment." For hours, Miss Marple watched families reunite, young people celebrate, old citizens walk through gaps in the concrete they once believed permanent. Krolov turned to her. "You have guided me beyond, perhaps, the world toward understanding. How can I ever repay such wisdom?" She shook her head. "Truth repays itself." As dusk fell over Berlin, Miss Marple walked along the fragments of the wall, each piece now a symbol of hope rather than despair. The Cold War was nearly over, but one chapter remained, the final revelation behind the long shadow she had been following since 1945. And Miss Marple, ever patient, ever perceptive, was ready for the end. Chapter 10, The Final Truth, 1991. The year was 1991. The Cold War, 46 years of fear, tension, espionage, and ideological division, was finally collapsing into history. Across Eastern Europe, flags changed, governments rose and fell, and the Soviet Union itself trembled on unsteady foundations. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple read the morning newspaper with a solemn calm. Soviet Union near dissolution. New nations emerge. Cold War ending. She folded the paper gently. "How strange," she murmured, "that something so enormous can end with so many quiet sentences." A knock interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Edwin Clark stood at her door, breathless, carrying a file thicker than any he'd ever brought her before. "Miss Marple," he said urgently, "Krolov has vanished." She opened the door wider. Vanished, yes. After Berlin, he worked with various governments to dismantle dangerous programs. But 2 weeks ago, he disappeared, leaving behind only a note asking for you. He handed her the note. "The final truth lies where the first shadow was cast." Miss Marple traced the words with her finger. "The beginning," she whispered. 1945. The lecture, Professor Elms. Clark nodded. We believe the last thread of the Cold War mystery leads back to him. Miss Marple sighed softly. Then we must return to where it all began. And so, she prepared for one final journey, one that would reveal the truth she had followed for nearly half a century. Miss Marple and Clark travelled to the one place where the first clue of the cold war had once taken shape. King's College Hall, where Miss Marple had attended that fateful lecture by Professor Elmswood and Professor Renck in 1945. The hall had changed very little. The wooden benches had been polished, the curtains replaced, but the echo of history still lingered like dust in the rafters. As they entered, they found a man waiting for them. Kroloff. He looked older now than the time between chapters could explain, not merely aged, but worn by choices, guilt, and years spent navigating between giants. Miss Marple, he whispered, I knew you would come. My dear, she said gently, taking his hand, you have walked a painful path. Clark stepped forward. Kroloff, why summon us here? Kroloff opened his briefcase and revealed a set of documents, yellowed, fragile, and unmistakably old. These, he said, are Professor Elmswood's original notes. Notes never published. Notes someone hid for decades. Miss Marple sat down slowly. His research, what was it truly about? Kroloff nodded. Not weapons, not espionage, something far more dangerous. He handed Miss Marple a page. In Elmswood's tidy handwriting were words that froze her blood. Fear is the world's strongest currency. Whoever controls fear will shape the next century. Clark whispered, This was not scientific. It was psychological, Kroloff said. Elmswood predicted how nations would manipulate populations, how fear could justify building weapons, starting wars, suppressing freedoms. His theories became the blueprint, misunderstood, for the Cold War itself. Miss Marple felt a wave of sorrow. So the Cold War began not with weapons, but with an idea. Yes, Kroloff replied, an idea he tried to warn against, and one that shadowed every event you and I encountered. Clark sank into a chair. And someone kept these notes hidden all this time. Kroloff nodded. Because Elmswood's truth would have exposed the foundations of the conflict. Miss Marple closed the folder gently. Then it is time that truth returns to the world. But before they could move, slow footsteps echoed through the hall. Miss Marple felt a chill. The Soviet officer. He emerged from the shadows with the same sorrowful expression he had carried in Berlin, Havana, Prague. But now there was something else. Finality. I was the keeper of Elmswood's notes, he said softly. I took them after his death. Not to exploit them, but to bury them. Kroloff stepped forward. Why hide the truth? The officer's eyes glistened. Because the truth was too powerful. Your governments both east and westward have used it to manipulate even more fear. Elmswood saw the future. He saw how leaders could twist terror into obedience. Clark frowned, but hiding it allowed others to misinterpret his ideas anyway. Yes, the officer whispered, and that is my greatest regret. Miss Marple approached him gently. You carried a burden no one should bear alone. He shook his head. I watched the world tear itself apart with shadows shaped by these theories. I followed you all because you understood the human heart, Miss Marple, and I hoped you would know when the world was finally ready for the truth. Miss Marple's voice softened with centuries of wisdom. The world is never ready for truth. It simply arrives when needed. The officer stepped closer and placed the final document into her hands. Elmswood's last page, he said. The one he wrote on the night he disappeared. Miss Marple read it silently. Fear ends only when courage becomes collective. She closed her eyes. It is time to end this shadow. Miss Marple, Clark, Krolov, and the Soviet officer spent hours reviewing the documents. Together, the final picture emerged. Elmswood had predicted the Cold War before it began. His theories had been stolen and used by early intelligence agencies. Krolov had been manipulated to refine those theories into mathematical models. Rogue actors on both sides had weaponized fear for decades. Proxy wars, sabotage, and misinformation had been guided by Elmswood's blueprint. And yet none of this was what Elmswood intended. Miss Marple spoke first. The Cold War was not a failure of diplomacy. It was a failure of understanding. Governments tried to use fear as a shield, but fear cannot defend anything. It only corrodes. Clark nodded slowly. If we reveal this, we reshape how history views the entire era, Krolov added, and perhaps prevent another age built on shadows. The Soviet officer looked at Miss Marple. But truth is dangerous, still. She gave him a gentle smile. So is silence. Together, they drafted a report neutral, factual, protective of names where needed, revealing of mechanisms where essential, not a condemnation, but a clarification. A final chapter to the Cold War. Weeks later, as the Soviet Union formally dissolved and new nations emerged from its ashes, Miss Marple sat by her window in St. Mary Mead, watching the evening light settle softly on her rose garden. The world had changed once more. Clark arrived with fresh newspapers. Miss Marple, the report has been received. International bodies accepted it. They're calling it the Marple Clarification. She chuckled softly. Good heavens, I'd rather they named a rose after me. Clark's expression grew tender. You helped close the Cold War with truth instead of fear. Miss Marple looked outside, eyes shining with wisdom gathered over a century. No, dear, humanity did that. People tore down walls, chose courage over silence, and questioned shadows. I merely followed the clues. A quiet knock came at the door. The Soviet officer stood. There, no longer an agent, no longer a keeper of secrets, simply a man at peace. I wanted to thank you, he said, for lifting the weight of history. Miss Marple nodded. History always belongs to everyone, not to those who twist it. As he left, Krolov approached from the garden path. It is over, he said gently. Miss Marple smiled. Nothing is ever truly over, my dear. But fear has weakened, and that is enough. She returned to her armchair, the last rays of sunset filling the room. Truth, she whispered, is the only wall that never falls. And with that, Miss Marple closed the final chapter of the Cold War gracefully, wisely, and with the quiet strength that had carried her through a century of shadows.